Welcome back. Let's jump right into this explainer and pick up exactly where our historical narrative left off. You might remember that in our previous session, we walked through the ancient origins of English evidence law, tracing it all the way from trial by ordeal to the birth of the jury system, and finally right up to the pressure for reform in the 19th century. Well, today we're going to bridge the gap between those old English origins and the actual reality of modern Ugandan courts. So, recall Jeremy Bentham's intense push to reform that highly complex and honestly often contradictory English common law. Today, we're going to see how that very pressure ultimately birthed the Evidence Act's Cap 8. Yes, the exact same statute that governs your legal studies and your future practice in Uganda today. Here is a quick roadmap of what we'll be covering today. We'll start with the Indian Codification Project, then track its journey to East Africa, discuss independence and Cap 8, explore how Uganda built its own legal tradition, look at persuasive Commonwealth authority, and finally end with a big discussion question. Let's start right off with Section 1, the Indian Codification Project. Now, here's a fascinating fact. The major reform of English evidence rules didn't actually start in London. It started in British India, and it was led by this crucial figure, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen. Back in 1871, this jurist and colonial administrator faced an absolutely immense challenge. He had to take a sprawling, inconsistent mass of English common law and distill it into a systematic, written code that could actually work across India's highly diverse courts. And he pulled it off. Stephen brilliantly organized centuries of scattered judicial decisions into a single coherent structure, giving us the Indian Evidence Act of 1872. For the first time, a court had one single statute, providing clear, written answers to most evidence questions. It was a real game changer. Let's trace that timeline so you can see exactly how we got here. We move from Stephen's Indian draft in 1871 to the official Indian Evidence Act in 1872. Then, we see its adoption in the Uganda Protectorate in the late 19th century. The statute actually survives past Ugandan independence in 1962, continuing right up to the modern 2024 revised edition. That is the Cap 8 statute you absolutely must master for your exams today. Moving right along to Section 2, Journey to East Africa. So, how did an Indian statute end up here? Well, it really just comes down to the practical realities of colonial administration. The British administrators governing East Africa needed a functional legal system that could stretch across vastly different territories, often managed by folks with wildly varying levels of legal training. The 1872 Act offered a ready-made, elegant solution. It was already drafted and had already been tested in Indian courts, it was written in English, and crucially, it was very familiar to British administrators who had previously served in India. But introducing it wasn't seamless. Its imposition actually created a strict dual system in the Protectorate. On one side, you had formal courts, like the High Court and subordinate courts, applying these foreign, English-derived evidence rules. But on the other side, local councils and chiefs, acting as customary courts, were relying on completely different local traditions and principles to resolve their disputes. Now grab your pens, because this is a vital point for your notes. Colonial adoption was an imposition. It was absolutely not a thoughtful consultation process. As students of Ugandan law, understanding this history is key. That historical lack of local input explains exactly why some specific provisions of Cap 8 might still feel a bit disconnected from Ugandan social realities and customary practices even today. Okay, that brings us to Section 3, Independence and Cap 8. October 9th, 1962. A massive turning point. Upon gaining independence, Uganda, much like most former British colonies, had a choice to make. They didn't immediately toss out their inherited legal framework. Instead, the Evidence Act was retained, and in that moment, it instantly transformed from a colonial imposition into a statute of a newly sovereign state. And it hasn't just sat on a shelf gathering dust since then. Through systematic revisions over the decades, the Act has been continuously updated. Write these years down. The laws were revised in 1964, then in 1990, again in 2000, and most recently we have the 2024 revised edition. Through each of these careful steps, the Act was renumbered and refined into what you now correctly cite as the Evidence Act Cap 8. Let's dive into Section 4, Building Uganda's Legal Tradition. You see, Uganda definitely did not freeze the 1872 Act in time. Rather, courts and lawmakers used four main pillars to mold it into a living, local document. We have pre-1977 East African case law, we have specific Ugandan judicial development from local appellate courts, modern legislative updates, and importantly, the 1995 constitutional overlay. Let me give you a concrete example. I am going to say this citation slowly, so please write it down carefully. Uganda versus Doi Wabwire Kyoyo, 1976, HCB 212. This is a foundational Ugandan judicial decision. In this case, the courts independently established strict local procedures for confessions, purposefully interpreting the act for the Ugandan context. Similarly, take a note of this one. Uganda versus Ntambazi, 1996, HCB 29. This case beautifully demonstrates the Ugandan judiciary stepping up and independently developing their own strict local rules for identification parades. It's proof that Ugandan courts were actively building their own unique jurisprudence right on top of that inherited framework. Furthermore, the modern context has reshaped how the Act functions entirely. New legislation, like the Electronic Transactions Act Cap 99 and the Electronic Signatures Act Cap 98, cover digital realities that, let's face it, simply didn't exist in 1872. Even more powerfully, the 1995 Constitution's strict fair hearing mandates, specifically Articles 28, 44, and 50, now heavily constrain exactly how these old evidence rules can legally operate in modern courts. Which leads us nicely into Section 5, Persuasive Commonwealth Authority. Now, as you read through your modern Ugandan evidence textbooks, you might find yourself wondering, why on earth do I still see so many foreign cases in here? Well, it all comes down to shared ancestry. Because Commonwealth nations like Uganda, India, Kenya, and Tanzania share that exact same 1872 DNA in their evidence statutes, decisions from their respective courts remain highly persuasive authority in Uganda. When foreign courts interpret provisions that are virtually identical to Cap 8, Ugandan judges naturally pay very close attention. For example, make a note of this famous 1939 Privy Council case. Again, I'll read it slowly. Pakala Narayana Swamy versus King Emperor, AIR 1939, PC 47. Because this case interpreted dying declarations under the Indian Act, it is still regularly cited in Ugandan courts today to interpret the identically sourced Section 30 of Cap 8. And that brings us to our final stop, Section 6, the big discussion question. So let's pull this all together. The crucial takeaway is this. This law was drafted by Stephen way back in 1871. It was adopted as a pragmatic colonial measure across East Africa. It was purposefully retained by a sovereign Uganda post-independence, and then it was thoroughly indigenized by decades of brilliant Ugandan jurisprudence and the 1995 Constitution. Which leads me to leave you with a final Socratic thought to ponder, not just for your exams, but for your future practice. After more than 150 years of using a law that literally originated in British India, is it time for a change? Should Uganda write its own completely new evidence statute from scratch to reflect modern Ugandan realities? Think deeply about what would be gained in cultural relevance, and conversely, what might be lost in terms of over a century of established, shared Commonwealth jurisprudence if Uganda discarded Cap 8 entirely. Thank you for joining me in this explainer. Study your citations well, and I will see you in the next one.